Chris will come. I know we have you down.
Ms. Zalatel is also on the line.
And
Ms. Zalatel.
We're all ready to go.
Okay, I'll start the recording. Oops, you already started? Okay.
What is this? What is the ninth. Thank you. I would like to call to order this work session of the Anchorage Assembly regarding AOs 2021-82 and 2021-83. It is Thursday, September 9th, and we are noticed from noon to 1. We'll go ahead and get started with introductions, and I believe we have on the phone. Ms. Eller?
Yes, I'm on the phone.
Thank you. Ms. Zalatel?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. And then we'll go ahead around the room.
Cameron Perez-Rodilla. John Weddleton.
Pete Peterson. Felix Severa.
Crystal Kennedy. Austin Kennedy.
Doris Dunbar.
Suzanne LaFrance.
Travis Frist, CFO.
Amy Demboski.
Bob Dole.
Dean Peterson, the council.
Great. Thank you all for being here. We'll go ahead and get started, and if the administration would go ahead and start by walking us through the 2 AOs, which are on the agenda for the Tuesday, September 14 Assembly meeting. They're public hearing items 14B and 14C.
Mass care first. Yeah, I think we have it listed for mass care first. So we'll start. We have 2. One is for mass care, and Bob Dole is here on behalf of the administration to speak to that, answer any technical questions you may have. And the other one is regarding the potential, a different funding source for some of the COVID response. So we'll start with the mass care, if you don't mind. Bob, I'll let you just kind of speak to it if you will.
Thank you. Through the chair, Development Services Director Bob Dole. AO 2021-82 provides funding to continue the full range of mass care operations we're currently operating through the end of October. Currently, we are scheduled to run out of funding for the congregate or the mass shelter operation at the Sullivan on September 15th, and the non-congregate or the other operations you see in the hotels and non-critical transport by September 30th. This bill basically provides funding for a month and a half of funding for extending up the a mass shelter such as the Sullivan, and also another 30 days for the non-congregate shelter. In doing that, we have looked at used costs from existing contracts. However, we will continue to compete contracts as they become available to save the taxpayer money. We envision that this money will be reimbursable from FEMA ultimately sometime down the road as an emergency protective measure in COVID response to a declared federal disaster. The CFO is better prepared than I am to speak to timing on that. However, as an IC incident commander in recovery and from the state level, I think it would be, except that period may take years to get your full extent back. I'm prepared to answer about any specific components in there if there are any questions from the assembly.
Thank you, Mr. Dole. Actually, Ms. Zalatel is on the line with a question. Ms. Zalatel?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I noticed, and I just heard that this is through the end of October. That seems like a short period of time to request funding for, given that I don't see us winding down mass care prior to the end of the year. Is there any reason we wouldn't want to just fund mass care, congregate, non-congregate care through the end of the year to provide that continuity so that we don't have a rush to possibly come back and do another appropriation item? Of course, you know, always if we appropriate the funds, they don't necessarily have to be spent if there's some change. And I'm wondering if there's been any thought to that, and any thought to that given now that HUD has said there's 100% reimbursement for mass care through the end of the year.
And let me just pause to note that we've been joined by Mr. Constant at 12:05.
Through the chair, Assembly Members Alatel, first, I believe it's FEMA that will be a potential reimbursement source, not HUD, who I know does other programs as the source out there. The CFO can speak to specifics in terms of funding. However, it's generally costing us about $3 million a month to operate mass care. That is a substantial amount of money to cash flow to basically commit and tie up, so it is not available for other uses, and the impact it has on the funds. I'd also note that if there's anything we know about COVID today, it's that we don't know about COVID. There is a lot of risk in forecasting what we have to do to respond to COVID the further out we go. In looking at this and extensive consultation across the administration, we felt for where we are now, this was a good starting point to determine where we can responsibly fund out to and what we can do now, meeting the needs in response to COVID, but not tying up excess funds that won't be available for other things, impacting and doing other things the CFO can better talk about. In short, it meets the operational needs for the foreseeable period that we feel we can accurately define the operational needs.
Thank you, Mr. Dole.
Thank you, Mr. Dole. Madam Chair, may I just follow up really quick?
Yes, go ahead, Ms. Alatel.
Thank you. This is a comment. I just let you know it's my intention to bring an amendment to fund mass care through the end of December. I don't foresee the need for mass care to end prior to the end of December, with the reassurances from the federal government that there is 100% reimbursement for this, and it's more consistent with how we've operated in the past to ensure the continuity of this care. Which I think is, since it's serving over 750 people and we expect a winter influx, that this is a critical piece. So I will be submitting that amendment for discussion Tuesday night. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Alatel. We have next Mr. Dunbar, then Mr. Peterson, then Mr. Weddleton. Mr. Dunbar?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have two initial questions. These are probably better directed toward Mr. Frisk than Mr. Dole. So on FEMA reimbursement, and I understand that FEMA often takes a long time to get funds to us, but where are we exactly? How many months behind are we in terms of reimbursement for mass care? How much money have we received from FEMA to date, and how much is left outstanding?
Through the chair, yes. No, that's Bob's side of it. Apologize. Through the chair, Assemblymember Dunbar, the FEMA reimbursement is sporadic, and I say that because we still have expenditures that we've submitted for reimbursement from 2020 that have not yet been paid. So we're 12 to 14 months delayed in some of those. There are other reimbursable items that we've submitted to FEMA and they've been paid in 2 months. It appears from my short time here that what we are getting reimbursed on in a quicker time frame is the vaccinations and the testing. So we're seeing those turn in a rather rapid fashion when working with FEMA. FEMA can take years and years and years to pay. So we need to be cautious of how we spend money with the assumption that we're going to get reimbursed. There may be a time in the future in which FEMA says reimbursements, they may come and say there's a time for reimbursements to stop, and that may have actually already come and gone when it comes to congregate and non-congregate sheltering. We're still waiting for guidance on that particular part. So I just want to have a little caution here about what we are or not going to get reimbursed on. At this point in time, we have, I think the number is $88 million worth of reimbursements that have been submitted at this point in time, and we are only approximately 26.5 million reimbursed at this point, so about 25%. We're anticipating that we should see over the next 2 months another 12 million come in. Again, it's all subject to FEMA and their payment time frame, but our paperwork is submitted and has been accepted at the state level. It's FEMA's reimbursement process at that point.
can you be a little more specific on, you're talking about, so we're getting reimbursed more frequently on the vaccination and testing. Have we been reimbursed at all on mass care? And if so, how much have we been reimbursed on mass care and how much is left outstanding?
To my knowledge, at this particular point in time, we have not been reimbursed for mass care, and either congregate sheltering or non-congregate sheltering at this time. Everything we've been receiving is for reimbursements on vaccinations and testing. But I will double check that for you. That is my understanding. Again, we have expenditures from 12 to 14 months ago that we haven't been reimbursed on yet. Okay?
Okay, and then my other question is, and then this relates to the next ordinance as well. So we have the 10 and 2 that the accounts that we try to maintain, 8.25, 2 to 3. How much is in those accounts right now?
I can't give you an exact number right at this particular minute. I can get that for you later today. It'll be an as of the end of the month that we've closed, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, the last one we closed in July at this time.
Okay.
So I can get you a number. However, that 10 and 2 and such is it's predicated on the balances as of 12/31. So that's the snapshot in time that we're really concentrating on. That's the number. It's not on a monthly basis rolling forward.
Okay, well, I mean, yeah, I think that number is certainly relevant to the discussion of the next ordinance as well. And if you could get some approximation of what's in those accounts, that would be very helpful. Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Next, we have Mr. Peterson, then Mr. Weddleton, and then Ms. Zalatel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Dunbar asked the same question I was going to ask.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Mr. Weddleton?
So, in your introductory remarks, well, someone, maybe it was Bob or Travis, said that going for more than this amount restrains the budget in other ways. What would can you give me some examples to think about for medicine?
Through the chair, I will defer to the CFO for the technicalities. In emergency management, however, one of the key aspects is you don't tie up resources you're not sure you need, they're not available for other things. Money is the ultimate of all resources. When I look at this and conducting an emergency response operation, one of my requirements is that I not tie up a resource that may be needed elsewhere. And CFO, I will defer to there, but just a sound emergency management principle is if you're not sure you're going to use it, you don't ask for it.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Actually, we will go next to Ms.
Well, I don't know, as Commissioner President, is there a are there real world constraints if we if suppose Meg comes forward with an amendment that's 3 times this amount, would that impact other uses?
Through the chair, Mr. Weldon, I'll defer to Ms. Nabosky.
Thank you, Mr. Chris. Through the chair, Mr. Weddleton. We do anticipate there are going to be other departments that are going to come forward with needs. We have already identified the APD overtime budget, for example, was short funded in the previous budget cycle based on historical averages. And we're talking multiple millions of dollars likely. So if the assembly were to encumber or dedicate the money towards this particular need without emergency management or mass care saying they actually need it, you could be creating a little bit more of a challenge with other needs that are going to be coming down the line. So we're working with departments to identify ahead of time what those issues are. But that is one example of something that I've recently identified that I will be coming forward to the assembly to rectify.
Can I just make sure I understand that, because I appreciate that. So the idea is that if we're going into the fund balance, and we'll bump into that ceiling to the 10% and the 2%. You want to retain some room in there so you could pull some out for the overtime.
And again, Mr. Middleton, the assembly has the ability to appropriate from whichever funds you believe is appropriate. So that's kind of the concept of teeing up the next one for a conversation. So the assembly can start thinking about how they want to manage this. But I think particularly for the interfund loan, I think there's been about 11 or 12 other instances where the Assembly has utilized this mechanism for COVID response. And the CFO will have to confirm it, but just looking at it in reality, you may have already dipped, you're certainly below the 2%, you might be below the 10%. And that for your fiscal situation is something that the appropriating body, which is the Assembly, should really contemplate. And that's the reason the second one was brought forward, is so we could start having that conversation. But at this time, this was the prudent way to go forward when we look at managing the entire city and the needs of the entire city, including the needs of the fire department, the police department, health department during a pandemic. We just thought it would be more prudent for you to give us what we actually need right now to get us through October 31st. But I also want to reemphasize what I had said with the COVID response last appropriation for testing and vaccination. One of the things we're doing is we're trying to realign contracts, and we're trying to leverage and put out potentially a more competitive contract to drive the price down of delivering these services. So this isn't just about funding to what we need. I mean, the reality is, if you guys come back and say, okay, they don't need $4 million, we're going to go ahead and appropriate 10 or 12 million. When we put those RFPs out, people are going to know when they bid what our top line is. It's just not a good negotiating strategy. And so we're going forward saying we need this till October 31. It'll give us the opportunity to go out and try to get a more competitive bid so we get more bang for your buck and for the taxpayers' buck. So from that negotiating standpoint and management standpoint, I think we're just trying to be cautious and prudent with the taxpayers' money and trying to give the Assembly and the administration the most competitive advantage to get you the best price to deliver the services, if that makes sense.
Pieces of it make perfect sense. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Whittleton. Before we go to back to Ms. Zelatil, we'll go to Ms. Kennedy and then Ms. Quinn Davidson. Ms. Kennedy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I very much appreciate what Ms. Demboski was really just talking about, because I know, like for me, I made the point that when we were doing our first quarter budget review, we already had a negative fund balance, which tells me that we're already operating in a way where we're spending more than we're taking in. And, I certainly understand this fund loan mechanism, if you will, but at some point, money going out is going to catch up with the lack of money coming in. So what does that really do just from a banking or an accounting standpoint? What does that really do to our cash flow when we know that we have these expenses, but we don't know when those expenses will actually get paid for? At what point do we go, oops, there's really not a dollar in the checkbook right now to pay for this? I mean, what happens there when all of these things tend to catch up, so to speak? And I don't know who I'm putting on the spot there, but.
Madam Kenny, that's when you fire your CFO. You are correct, though. We do have to be super conscious of the outflow of cash and the lack of reimbursement from FEMA, which is why I'm cautioning everyone that we can't just keep saying we're going to get reimbursed. We may, but it may take years. And we're doing everything we can to find alternative funding sources versus doing interfund loan. When we are receiving the reimbursements from FEMA, we are making sure that we, for the lack of better terms, put to bed the interfund loans that first in, first out kind of situation. So your EO1 that came in, which I'm going to throw this number out, but it's not exactly correct. I think it was $6 million, I think was the number. And so we've already received $6 million worth of reimbursements. That interfund loan has now gone per se off the books. So it is a rolling forward situation as we are hitting the interfund loan, depleting the money, and then as we reimburse, we retire the numbers coming out on the back end of it. But again, if we keep spending the money before we get it back, we're not in a good way at this point, and we need to have some fiscal certainty on this as far as continuing the interfund loan program, which is why you'll see on 2021-83, there's an alternative funding source for a previously approved AO from the previous meeting. It's an alternative to what we provided, which was another interfund loan at that time. It's just for discussion purposes more than anything at this point.
And I'll follow
Go ahead, Ms. Kennedy.
Then I guess my next question would be, is there a emergency stop point? Are we looking at percentages of the trend of money coming in versus money going out? Do we know that there's a hard stop point by which we have to say, we just can't do this anymore, so we're gonna default? How does that look? What's that look like?
Through the chair, Ms. Kennedy, at this point, I don't have that specific number, but in my personal opinion and professional opinion, I think we're getting close at this point. It's a matter of, on a day-by-day basis of coordinating with the public finance as well as Fema reimbursement specialist and our controller to try to come and pinpoint these numbers, as well as working with OMB to make sure we know what's encumbered, available, where it's located and such. I don't have a hard number for you at this point in time.
Okay, but the number that you have in this AO, you think we're okay with at this point?
The $4 million, yes, ma'am.
Okay,
Yes, ma'am.
thank you.
Yeah, purely because of the fact that we anticipate within the next 4 to 6 weeks of potentially getting $12.5 million back in. And again, it's one of those situations where that $12.5 million coming back in is going to retire a previous interfund loan. So, but it will free up money for us at that point in time.
All right, thank you. Mr. Manager.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. Next, Ms. Quinn Davidson, followed by Ms. Velatel and Mr. Perez-Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So Mr. Frisk, you haven't been able to talk with some of the credit rating agencies about this specifically, or where we are, what would get concerned for them yet?
Through the chair, Ms. Quinn Davidson, actually, it's ironic that we're having this discussion right now. I was on a Fitch rating call this morning, and it wasn't a one-on-one, it was in a group format. One of the situations that they did present during that meeting was the utilization of rainy day funds, i.e. your balances for previous COVID responses. What they have indicated, Fitch has, is that if you use your rainy day fund in 2020, that was understandable. What they don't believe will be understandable from a rating perspective will be utilization of 2021, since there was so much stimulus money that was put into not only state but local governments that really shouldn't have been using our rainy day funds. We should have been using money that came in from the government. So again, that's the comment that was made today. It would be concerning to me if we missed the 10-2 at the end of the year for potential trigger for a downgrade. I think our mitigation point with the fact that we're seeking reimbursement from Fema, we have a history of getting some payments back at this point, would help us avoid a downgrade. But it is a concern.
Yeah. And can I follow up? Sure. Thank you, that's helpful. Just for some historical perspective, a couple months before I left acting mayor role, my staff met with credit rating agencies who said that cities across the country are dipping below their reserves. And that was, at that point, somewhat expected and didn't actually cause an issue for the city itself. Things change, so just, if you can just keep us posted, that would be really helpful.
Through the chair, Ms. Quinn Davidson, that is exactly what they were reiterating today, is that they understood the need to dip below in 2020 to respond, but they don't feel that government should be dipping below in 2021 simply because there was so much stimulus money being injected into everybody's economy that they feel it was not necessary to do that.
Will they do they typically issue an opinion or something that explains the rationale and sort of the timelines? Because that might be helpful for us as we're making these decisions.
I can check and see if there's anything. I've never seen one, but it doesn't mean there isn't one and I can't ask for it. Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Quinn Davidson. Next, we have Ms. Velatel, then Mr. Perez-Garcia, then Mr. Dunbar, and Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to get clarification. I didn't quite understand. I thought I heard that we had not received any reimbursement from FEMA with regards to mass care. And I just wanted to ask if I had heard correctly or if I could get clarification.
Through the chair, Mrs. Elatel, that's my understanding is that we haven't received reimbursement for mass care at this particular point in time. I'll double check that again with Alden Third, who handles all of our reimbursements. That's my understanding, but I've got a bunch of different FEMA that are running through my head, specifically because we're still receiving reimbursements at this particular point in time as well. So let me double check that and return back to the assembly with an answer on that, a specific number, if we have and where we're at.
I appreciate that. And the reason update from Craig Campbell with regard to some questions I asked pertaining to the facilitation, and it indicated we'd received 15 million out of 37.3 million submitted for reimbursement against 2 of 4 projects. Of the total reimbursed, mass care was 3 million, and then another 4 million was being submitted within the next week. And 2 additional projects that have not been obligated by FEMA as of today. There was an additional 3.5 million in expenditures under those projects. So it sounds like there's kind of a rolling in and out at mass care with regard to reimbursement. So some clarity on that would be really helpful because mass care isn't just congregate and non-congregate shelter. It also covers quarantine and isolation beds, which I know have increased in usage in the recent weeks. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Alatel. Mr. Dunbar?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Frisk, I just want to ask, so how do rating agencies treat or calculate outstanding FEMA payments or FEMA debt, if you will?
Well, the FEMA reimbursement will, when we do get our annual financials, excuse me, I'm sorry, through the chair, Mr. Dunbar, when we do have our annual financial report finished for 2020, what you will notice on there is there will be a FEMA accounts receivable. This will illustrate the amount of expenditures we have outstanding that we've been obligated to get paid for, that we haven't been paid for at this particular point in time. Again, when a rating agency is going to review, they're going to review your balance sheet, they're going to review your income statements and such. That will bode well that, you know, we have money out, our assets, our liquidity is down a little bit, but we have an accounts receivable specifically sitting there waiting for reimbursement from FEMA. One of the biggest things that in my history that any entity that would get downgraded would be on their inability to make their obligated payments. So that's the primary driver. This 10-2 is our policy, and the agencies like that, to have a rainy day fund. If we can illustrate that we missed, but we have mitigating circumstances, which again is a healthy, robust AR for FEMA, we can mitigate that potential downgrade. It's just a trigger. It's not necessarily the coup de grace, if you want to call it that. Missing your payment obligation would be a death sentence at this point, and we're not there.
So on that call with Fitch, did they talk about FEMA reimbursements?
I specifically asked the question on it.
What did they say?
They basically said that it should be a listing on your balance sheet, and that helps to offset the fact that you're below. You do have, you're shifting money is essentially how they explained it.
So that kind of follow on. Sure. Madam Chair. So that makes a lot of sense to me. And I could see how the rating agencies might look askance at cities that dip below their 10-2 when even accounting for the FEMA reimbursables because their economies were weak or what have you. But you know, the initial CARES Act funds were not intended, you know, we had to go through some pretty difficult gymnastics just to shore up the municipality from that initial payment. The ARPA funds arguably could have gone more directly towards the city, but there was still a pretty strong argument from the public that should go to small business grants. It should go to rental assistance and do those kind of things. But I'm sure there are cities in the country that even taking in their FEMA reimbursable into account, they have mismanaged their money so they're under 10 and 2. But my understanding is that is not the case in Anchorage, that but for everything that's happened with FEMA, we would have our 10 and 2. Is that correct?
Well, just to make sure we're speaking apples to oranges here, we could potentially miss our 10 and 2, but the mitigating offset is the fact that we have a higher FEMA AR at that point. You know, I'm not saying that, I hope we don't, and we're working and striving not to, which is one of the reasons why we're trying to come up with alternative funding sources versus the interfund loans that could potentially impact that. What I am saying is that we could miss the 10 and 2 and not get downgraded simply because of the fact we have a sizable AR for FEMA.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. My apologies, Mr. Perez-Verdilla, I skipped you in the queue.
Oh, no, thank you. And actually, several of my questions have already been asked. So just one small question. Even though this is requesting a temporary extension in funds, is it the administration's intention to fund mass care beyond this?
Through the chair, Development Services Director Bob Dole, standing to my left. My understanding is we'll continue to do mass care as is reasonable and necessary for COVID response. Our program, it is an emergency response measure. And we'll look as the need arrives and as the need evolves in terms of the level to which we need to fund it in response to the needs of our citizens.
Can I ask it again? Do you anticipate needing to fund mass care beyond the period of time that this is requested? It's a pretty short period of time. So I'm wondering if it's your anticipation that you will likely have to come back and request additional funds in order to continue to fund mass care.
Through the chair, if I look at the hundreds of folks currently receiving through mass care, I envision some level beyond that date in terms of saying what that level of need is and what it costs as we consolidate the bids. I can't quantify it though, and I think we should quantify money before we ask for a lot of it.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Perez-Verdilla. Ms. Kennedy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Considering that we have this negative fund balance and we have quite a bit of money, tens of millions of dollars in interfund loan, and I guess the way I'm looking at it is we're essentially operating a bit on credit right now. So are we at risk of actually violating our budget, our balanced budget requirement? At what point can we say we aren't balanced because we're waiting for promissory notes to come in more or less? So I don't have any idea about how that really functions and and what happens when you are considered violating that. And maybe that's not something that you can speak to right now, but that would just, that was just of interest to me if we were really understanding what that means to have a balanced budget and what happens when you actually don't. So anyway, a general concept, I guess, question.
Through the chair, Assemblymember Kennedy, the administration is adamant we will make our budget that has been previously passed by the Assembly with potential. There may be a potential couple outliers. I mentioned APDs over time, right? That's probably not going to be a surprise to you. But when it comes to interfund loans or financing, these are things that we're definitely looking at and we're concerned about. But this, I think, is a bigger discussion for another day, I think. But it's one that is very much on the forefront of our mind. And that's the reason we're coming forward with, Director Dole has scoped out what he believes he needs for mass care, what he can actually project, and what he can reasonably say is mass care. And that's why we're not asking you for more. We're trying to be as judicious and as prudent with the taxpayers' money as possible, because it is a concern.
Thank you. I understand that. I guess it's just, like I said, we have this balanced budget requirement, And, knowing that we are making expenditures that are greater than revenues. And I'm just kind of wondering at what point that kicks in and what happens, if you've blown your budget, what happens? Really, essentially, what happens? So anyway, that would be a good conversation maybe to have later, just to understand a little bit more of what's at stake. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. Okay, and I think in that discussion, we got into some aspects of the next AO. Oh, Mr. Weddleton, before.
Yeah, and they all match up together, but
Yeah.
so, looking at this 10-2 policy, so does it specify the liquidity level? Because we don't leave that money to sit in cash and all kinds of investments. So accounts receivable for FEMA is basically a wash. Or do we have to have a certain amount of liquidity?
No, through the chair, Mr. Weddleton, we are required by the code to have a certain amount of liquidity. And ARs are not classified as a liquid asset, therefore it's not part of the calculation for the 10-2.
How liquid is it? How liquid is it supposed to be? 30 days or?
I'd have to double check that, but it should be liquid, period, to the point of easily accessible within a couple days. The municipal cash pool does not have any long-term positions within its structure. And typically we have 3 different levels of managers at that point, with each being specified to do certain things. But the point is that at any given point in time, we can make a phone call and have liquidity into the checking accounts within a couple days versus 30 days or anything like that.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Okay, seeing no other members in the queue, is there anything that the administration would like to speak to for AO 2021-83 specifically?
Thank you for the opportunity, Chair LaFrance. I think we've made it pretty clear the reason we brought it forward, because we really wanted the Assembly to start critically thinking about your options and, as the appropriating body, what you believe is appropriate. The administration believes that rather than overutilization of the municipal, the interfund loan mechanism, we think there is this other set aside of money that could be reappropriated to utilize for COVID response. If you choose to go this route, then obviously we would make adjustments to your previous action, but it is an option. I think the work session probably is more helpful for you to talk amongst yourself about what you want to do, but we wanted to highlight for you that you do have options.
Thank you, Mr. Bosky. So we've got Ms. Zelatel, Mr. Constant, and then Ms. Quinn Davidson in the queue, and then Mr. Weddleton. Ms. Zelatel?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So my concerns with the proposed fund from the real estate CIP fund is twofold, and I kind of want to put them out there for discussion's sake. The first is, if we spend these funds, there will be approximately, I believe, $3 million in the fund remaining, and these are the funds that I, had previously been appropriated for the purchase of buildings, and I thought had been considered and previously been put forward by the administration if we were going to relocate mass care or look at a longer shelter solution for purposes of any capital expenditure. So this would significantly reduce that capital. The second concern I have is that ultimately reimbursement for FEMA expenses goes back into the 101 fund. And so without some specific limitation on how these funds will be reimbursed either back into the real estate CIP fund, we'll be depleting that fund and then just putting these funds in the 101 fund. And that, again, goes back to this concern or issue around if we were looking for capital for purposes of either building a shelter or any kind of capital expenditure around homelessness, as those funds were originally intended. So I just want to put those thoughts out there as we proceed through the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Zelatel. Does the administration want to comment? No. Thank you. Next, Mr. Constant.
So Ms. Alto really asked, the first part of her question was the question I have, and I'm not sure how to square the two. There's an effort going to either construct a navigation center or a number of locations, and I'm not sure what happens to that project if these funds are spent. So to me, that's the crux of the question of the funding source. Is this in conflict with the administration's proposal to secure new facilities for the movement of our shelter array?
Thank you, Mr. Constant.
I understand you don't have-
Chair LaFrance, yes, so I will comment. I will just say that the administration is pursuing other avenues. And we've had great success with the state and potentially bringing forward another source of funding for a navigation center. So we don't believe it's in conflict. We believe, right now the emergent need is clearly COVID is the first thing that we're dealing with as a community, and we're trying to make sure that residents are safe and they have the resources they need in order to get tested, get vaccinated, and also receive monoclonal antibody treatments should they need it. But that doesn't, I don't see these two things in conflict because we are actively and aggressively pursuing other avenues for potential funding for navigation center as well.
Ms. Dombowski. Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. So is this money that is currently in the Capital Improvements Project Fund, is that CARES Act money? Or was it run through first responder payroll?
Through the chair, Ms. Quinn Davidson, the money was originally appropriated through the CARES Act and then subsequently was reappropriated after that out of the CARES Act funds.
First responder payroll, okay. What I'm concerned about is using, so I guess what I don't understand is why wouldn't we use general fund money and then seek reimbursement rather than taking money that was CARES Act, moving it into a fund to use it for COVID, which we could already get reimbursement about? Are we missing an opportunity to get reimbursement, or are you planning to use this money and then seek reimbursement for it as well? And is that allowed since it was CARES Act?
I'll have to get back to you on that.
Okay.
The short answer is we wouldn't be looking for reimbursement on this, obviously, through FEMA.
Okay.
But as far as if it would be in violation of the CARES Act, I'll have to double check that. I do not believe it is, but I will double check it.
Since it went through first responder payroll, it might be okay, but I just would want to make sure we're not, you can't get reimbursement on other federal funds maybe, so just something to think about. And then I guess I just don't understand, same point as Chris, which is if you're gonna spend money on some solution that you all are working on, I think really in earnest, why would you move money out of that fund? So just a comment again. And then I guess that's it for now. I think I don't understand the bigger concept of why would we do this when you could use the general fund money and seek reimbursement. So
Through the chair, Assemblymember Quinn Davidson, the general concept is actually quite plain. What I've been saying all along is we have great concern that the 10% and 2% policy that the municipality has held, frankly, is not going to be sustainable with the amount of times the interfund loan has been used. And so the point is, as soon as we identified that this could be a potential issue, we wanted to bring the Assembly another alternative, and we wanted to bring it up as a conversation so the Assembly could start really thinking critically about how are we going to fund these types of efforts moving forward. The interfund loan is not a perpetual source of funds that is, there is a point where we have to stop. And so we wanted to bring it to your attention that this might be another option. Of course, it's up to the Assembly's decision. You're the appropriating body. That's why it was brought forward, is because the interfund loan, there is a time where we're gonna have to stop that.
And I guess if I can just follow up quickly, thank you, Ms. Dombowski. I think the bottom line is we're in the middle of a pandemic and our reimbursement is secured by the federal government. That's about as good as a loan gets. And I don't think that, my understanding is that rating agencies just a few months ago didn't believe what we're doing is a problem. So I guess I'd like to see some information from them directly that would make me change my mind about what we're doing. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Quinn Davidson. Next, Mr. Weddleton, Ms. Ellisell, and then Ms. Kennedy.
Thanks. So what exactly would this money be used for?
Through the chair, Mr. Wilton, so this would be used for COVID testing and vaccinations. The previous meeting, there was something from the health department relating to specifically COVID testing and vaccinations. If you notice, the amounts were exactly the same. We just got one on the agenda later, and that's why it came later. I wish it would have came at the same time. It didn't, but I still felt it was valuable for the assembly to consider. That's why we brought it forward. So we could change if you want to change the funding source, but that's what it would be used for, is COVID testing and vaccination.
Right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Ms. Ellisell?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think with this discussion about money in and out of the interfund loan, I'd like to see a full breakdown on FEMA expenses to date, the rate of reimbursement, the interfund loans, what's been repaid, what's been outstanding. It's been, I believe, the practice of the previous administrations to ask us to appropriate funds to respond to the pandemic pretty equal to those that had come back in for reimbursement. And according to the COVID page municipal updates from the September 18, 2021 situation report, it appears we've had reimbursement at approximately $14.3 million. So I just need to get a better sense of what's the in and the out, and if that report could be run and sent to all members. I think with any, if there's this concern about the 10 and 2, with any ongoing request, this would be really valuable information to have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ellisell. Ms. Kennedy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I'm just trying to understand this too. Isn't this really just this is a funding stabilization mechanism is kind of the way I'm looking at it, where we're gonna provide more effective cash flow in order to pay for these expenses that we really aren't being covered for yet, without exceeding the limitations that are required within the GF for bond rating and those kinds of restrictions and requirements that we have. So I mean, it's not really about, it really is about different money, and knowing that we have money available in these other accounts that we really don't have available in the general fund. So even though the reimbursement would come back, we're just trying to basically provide some kind of a mechanism that allows us to protect both the general fund requirements, but allows us to keep making payments on the things that we're trying to make payments for in order to deal with COVID-19. So is that correct? I mean.
Through the chair, Assemblymember Kennedy, I think that's a very fair way to look at it. I can't disagree with it. I think that's a very fair way to look at it, and that's how many of us were looking at it when we were evaluating what options we could give the Assembly to ensure the most stability for the municipality.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. And Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I was wondering, coming up on in a couple months, 3 years since the earthquake, and I'm wondering where are we at in reimbursements from FEMA for that? And if it takes them almost 3 years to get us the money for that, is the expectation going to be another 3 years before we get the other reimbursements from what we've already spent? Just, you probably don't have that information with you, but maybe if you do, but maybe provide that at a later time.
Through the chair, Mr. Peterson, you're 100% correct. I mean, we are 3 years out, almost 3 years completely out from the earthquake, and we still are receiving reimbursements, couple $100,000 at a time, essentially. I can come back with a better breakdown on FEMA reimbursement, not only from a COVID standpoint, but from an earthquake standpoint, give you guys a better look at what we are up against and such. the fact that it is 3 years out and we're still receiving earthquake and getting pushed back and such, that is a concern to me from a COVID standpoint of how long is it gonna take to get reimbursed? And such. So, the Assembly Member Zeltel even asked the question about percentage of expenditures and reimbursement rates and such. So I'll put together a summary of that and give you some information and numbers that go with it. And such. It'll probably take me a couple days to get that done. Try to get it done by end of the week, which is tomorrow, but most likely Monday at the earliest.
Bob had
Through the chair's indulgence, Development Services Director Bob Dole, I'd like to supplement that from previously being in a position where I looked at federal disasters from a state level, probably about 20 different disasters over 4 years where I was up there. In looking at those disasters where the state as a grantee would be then involved in the process because of the state match, 5 years was routine after a disaster for waiting for payment. For Katrina, while I was in the Alaska National Guard, we deployed folks down to Katrina. The payment for them came in 10 years later. Now realize, we're running 3 to 5 years as routine, and that was before we had every jurisdiction in the nation have a disaster at the same time. FEMA's not set up like the IRS that's used to taking care of everyone's tax return every year. They've done a phenomenal job changing their operation, but it's unprecedented for them. But in the FEMA process, 3 to 5 years is a routine. And 10 years was annoying, but not unheard of. So CFO is sweating days, weeks, months on a good day, but the FEMA timeframe is measured in years for reimbursements, and particularly for those that are a little more complex to process.
Thank you, that's what I was afraid of.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Thank you, Mr. Frisk. Thank you, Mr. Dole. Any other questions from members? Just a quick question. And Mr. Dole, you had mentioned that funding for mass care runs out in September 15. And then when does the funding for testing and vaccinations run out?
Thank you for the question. Pursuant to Assembly action, October 31st. So you'll notice that we're aligning all of them in an effort to try to negotiate better and drive the price down and still deliver the service.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Demboski. Any other questions? Just check. See if anyone on the phone has questions. I don't see anybody. All right, so these two items again will be before us. They're public hearing items, 14B and 14C on Tuesday, September 14th. Thank you to the administration here today and to members. And we have about 5 minutes until our Rules Committee meeting starts at 1. We are adjourned.